Hello, everybody, and welcome. Happy St. Patrick's Day, first of all. It's so good to see you here, all of you here, so many of you in green. I love it. Anyway, welcome to Georgetown, and welcome to our conversation here in Riggs Library, historic Riggs Library. We want to welcome those of you who are here in person and the hundreds of you who are watching online. Thanks for being with us. My name is Kim Daniels. I'm the director of the Georgetown's Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. So next month will mark a year since the passing of Pope Francis. His 12 years as the leader of the global Catholic Church were extraordinary in their focus on bringing the joy of the gospel to the world and also bringing the Church's mission of mercy to everyone, todos, todos, todos. From his early and consistent solidarity with migrants and refugees to his shepherding of the Church and in many ways the world during the COVID-19 pandemic, to his emphasis on synodality as a path for spiritual renewal and structural reform in the Church. Pope Leo XIV has also established his priorities early in his pontificate, recognizing the enormous changes that societies around the world are facing in our rapidly changing technological, economic, and societal contexts. In his first year, he has promoted peace in a world torn by war and violence, and has reminded Catholics that love for the poor is the heart of the gospel and the heart of our tradition. So today we'll discuss how Pope Leo shares Pope Francis's vision of the Catholic Church as a field hospital tending to the wounded, and what his priorities signal for both the Church and the world. I'm so glad to have my two good friends, Chris White and Austen Ivereigh, here with us today to discuss these questions. First, because I've known them forever, and it's wonderful to be together here on the stage. And secondly, because for our purposes today, they're both experienced journalists who've covered Pope Francis and Pope Leo closely. Austen Ivereigh is a UK-based writer, journalist, and commentator, best known for his books on and with Pope Francis. The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope. Here is my dog-eared copy, which students in the room will recognize as having been often assigned. Wounded Shepherd, Francis and his struggle to convert the Catholic Church. And Pope Francis, Let Us Dream, the Path to a Better Future. He is a fellow in contemporary church history at Campion Hall, Oxford. Chris White is the Associate Director of Strategic Initiatives here at the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, I'm very proud to say. He is the author of this book, also much assigned, Pope Leo XIV, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy. He's also a former Vatican correspondent and national correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. So let's begin our conversation right now. And Austen, I'm going to start with you. It's so great to have you here at Georgetown. I'm so glad you could make it. This time last year, Pope Francis was in Rome's Gemelli Hospital. He was battling double pneumonia and a sickness that he would never fully recover from. That led to his death on April 21st. You know Pope Francis well. You wrote 3 books about him, and you worked closely with him, writing another book with him. So as we approach the anniversary, I just want to begin by reflecting on his legacy and what he meant for the Catholic Church. What did his papacy mean for the Church and the world?
Wow. Well, thank you, Kim. It's great to be here, great to be with you. It's a huge legacy, and we will be unpacking it for more than a generation. During the papal transition last year, as you can imagine, I was doing a lot of media. I was with the BBC, and this question of how would you summarize his legacy was one that I had to think about quite a lot, because there are so many elements. You've already brought them out. I think I would come down finally, if I was to try to summarize it, is actually about evangelization. He showed us how to evangelize the contemporary world. And it's not just about what we believe. It's not just the content of our faith. I think under the previous 2 pontificates, we had become very good at defining truth. The problem is that we had left out the other part of the Christian story, which is the transformation of how we are with others. So in other words, it's not so much what we believe, but how we are when we are believed, the fruit of those beliefs. And everything about him was so focused on demonstrating the effect of a relationship with God in Christ. And he was almost bursting from the very beginning to communicate that, and communicating it not just through ideas, but in those famous gestures. So I would say that's the breakthrough, in a way, of Francis. And I was very struck, and it comes out really strongly in Chris's brilliant book on the Conclave. I was there. The Cardinals were looking for a pope, and they said, we can't go back. having seen this, how Francis has captivated the world, we can't go back now. Something has changed, something has shifted in the church as a result of Francis. So I would say it's fundamentally that. Also, I would say, if I was to focus on one other thing, he showed us how to live better in tension and disagreement in ways that are open to the Spirit, to show us that there is the path of conflict, which is fruitless, or there is the path of living in disagreement fruitfully and in tension, and that will bring us into synodality, which I think is his great legacy. So that's how I would summarize it, those two.
I want to come back in a little while to that idea of kind of living in the tension and a more fruitful path forward, the difference between conflict and tension, because I think that's so important for us here in our context in the United States. But first I want to come to you, Chris. So you were a reporter for the National Catholic Reporter at the time, this time last year. The movie Conclave had just come out. So everybody, it seemed, was talking about the Catholic Church and talking about the conclave. What were the cardinals who were tasked with choosing the next pope considering, and what was at stake at that time? Take us back to that week last year.
Yeah, so, Austen hinted at this. There was this real atmosphere in Rome, talking, Father Tom Rees was there, and there was this real sense that many of them did not want to go back. And I think between the death of a pope and the election of a new one, there are these meetings known as general congregations, and they're sort of backroom meetings where they're talking about, the cardinals are talking about the needs of the church, the needs of the world, and who we want to help navigate this time. And I think among them, there was this real sense that Pope Francis was a real trailblazer, particularly orienting the church towards synodality, this mode of being, this process where the church is attentive to as many of its members as it can to consider how its structures might become more inclusive and more participatory. And they thought this is the way of the future. It's the way, to use the words of Pope Francis, the way that God has called the church to be in the third millennium. And I think that was very much in mind. But I think they also wanted someone who could take what Francis started and work within the institutions of a very clunky place and help institutionalize it. And they were looking for a capable manager who could take this brilliant idea that Francis had and help systematize it. And I think that was top of mind. So I don't think they entered the conclave with, we want Robert Prevost. But they said, these are what we're looking for. And in those conversations, they developed this sort of profile of what they were looking for, and that's why we ended up having a fairly quick conclave. But I imagine we'll talk more about that.
We will, and I also want to talk more about this idea of synodality, which can sound like such a churchy word, but really means something important for both Francis and Leo going forward. But first, let's talk about you and when Cardinal Prevost first came across your radar.
Well, just to pick up where Chris was, it's clear that the cardinals were forming a mind. And those of us who were there to interpret the conclave obviously were reading and listening very carefully everything the cardinals were saying. And it seemed to me that they arrived fairly soon on the profile of the pope that they wanted. And the dynamic of a conclave, it's really before they go into the conclave, there is this 2-week period where they are building the profile. And then, of course, the challenge is how to match that profile with a flesh and blood cardinal, with a real person. And there I started to kind of get worried, actually, because I could see that the profile was very clear. I couldn't see that the papabili, the candidates being talked about in the press, matched that profile. And they were quite clear about the 3 elements that the Pope needed to be somebody who knew the Church of the world, a good governor, a great evangelizer, all those. So I started to become very worried. And then, and I did start to question, I confess this, we know that the Holy Spirit is in the conclave, but I was kind of going, where is the Spirit in this? Come on, come on. And then I heard, I think it was 4 days before the conclave opened, that the Latin Americans were pushing Robert Prevost. And in a very cartoonish way, I slapped my forehead. And I said, of course. And, one thing that Francis always taught me about the signs of the Spirit is the Spirit acts usually when things are looking very, very desperate at the last minute and will appear in the place you least expect. And, of course, people had been ignoring Prevost because he was American, because he'd only been there for 2 years. But the more I went into it, I realized that it was going to be him. Because the Latin Americans were behind him, so were the sort of European reformists, So too were the, I think, significant American cardinals. And everything I heard about him fitted the profile. So I then became really certain that it would be him. And then I had another anxiety, which is, you know, will they quickly enough realize that it is him? A wealthy friend phoned me, by the way, in those days and said, so who should I put my money on? You know, because you can bet on it. And I said, Robert Prevost. And he said, who? And he phoned me about 5 minutes later, and he said, don't be ridiculous. He's not appearing in any of the bookies, as we say in England, you know, lists. Anyway, he found a bookie who was offering 50 to 1. And he said, are you sure? And I said, trust me, believe me, he did very well.
Well, I feel like we all wish we had that.
Yeah,
those odds as well.
I believe I wish I had.
Yeah.
Just to go back down memory lane, I have this distinct memory. I think it was the Sunday before the conclave, which began on a Wednesday. And the three of us were having coffee at this Jenny's bar. It's a bar just about 10 minutes from the Vatican. And we all kind of kept saying, it seems to be headed in this direction. Could this happen? Could it be? And now here we are, a year later, talking about it.
I remember that coffee as well, and I remember the feeling of it percolating. This can't happen. It's not going to happen. Could it happen? And it was a really remarkable week in Rome. How about you? You were covering it, and you obviously this idea of a pope from the United States was something that everybody dismissed. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. You thought that Prevost would be a contender. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, since we're in the Archdiocese of Washington, I'll tease Cardinal Robert McElroy, who will be with us tomorrow night at a dialogue. Small plug there. Come tomorrow night in Dahlgren. He had, when he got his red hat, when he was made a cardinal in 2022, a reporter said to him, one of the chief jobs of a cardinal is to elect a pope. What do you think about the possibility of an American? And he said, I would strongly reject and never support the idea of an American pope. He's since recanted that position.
He loves it when Chris tells the story.
It's on the record, he said it. So, but that was really the consensus, you know, across the College of Cardinals for a very long time. It was just the conventional wisdom that a cardinal from this country could not be pope. The general consensus was that the U.S. has too much power in the world, and really placing an American with the papacy, and you already got the American presidency with many would argue too much power. It's just too much. It would be a bridge too far, and I think there was a concern that it would diminish the real global nature of the church of 1.3, 1.4 billion Catholics. But the trick to understanding how Cardinal Prevost emerged is that most of the men in that room really didn't think of him as a U.S. American. His passport was not a strike against him because, in his own words, he was formed most by his time in Peru as a young missionary priest. And he was part of a sort of a missionary diocese that was alive with the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. And that's where he really learned what it was like to walk with the people of God, and where lay people were co-responsible in the governance of the church. And that's what he knew. And so in Rome, when Pope Francis brought him there, 2 years before he became Pope, he was seen as a missionary from Peru, not so much an American. And he had this global experience of the church as being the head of his religious order, the Augustinians. And because of really those two, I think most people said, okay, he may have been born in Chicago, but he really understands the world as a pastor, as a missionary.
I think folks from Chicago would probably put a little bit of an emphasis on it.
Don't talk hard in free pitch.
But I very much remember that as well, and think that's very true. Let's go back, Austen, to the big moment. I remember I was on the set of CNN with our mutual friend Chris Lamb, and we saw the white smoke, and we got very excited. And then a little while later, we heard the name, Robertum Franciscum. And I want to sort of go back to you, where you were at that moment. Were you hoping for a Francis II? What did you hear when you heard the word Leo XIV? What does that mean?
So I was live with the BBC, and I'd been on air a lot that morning because, of course, it was the day 2 of the Conclave, so anticipation was increasing. And the presenter was a lovely woman called Mariam Mashiri, and we got on very well, and we had a good laugh. And we were talking a lot, partly to fill the time, about the conclave seagull. You remember the seagull that appears on the close to the chimney of the Sistine Chapel. And there was this moment where suddenly this fluffy little chick appeared. And Mariam got very excited. Oh, look at that lovely little chicken. And then she turned to me and said, Austen, what do you think this means? And I said, I think that seagull family knows that something important is about to happen. And I'll swear a minute later, white smoke gushed from the chimney. She said, how did you know? And I said, stuff like that happens around here, Mary. So no, I remember that. But then, of course, we had, after the white smoke, there's then quite a long time before we have the Cardinal coming out to announce who it is. And it's a very curious moment when you're on air. You must have felt it, where you've been preparing for this, but you just don't know who it's going to be, and there's no way of knowing. Everybody finds out at the same time. So I was pretty strongly convinced it would be Prevost. And I was trying to cycle through in my mind the scenarios that if it wasn't what I might say, which would have been much harder. So, I mean, I suppose my reaction, and this is, by the way, very different from 2013 when I was reporting for Sky News and at Bergoglio, it was such a shock, such a surprise. And I remember the challenge of trying to explain who Bergoglio was. It was very different for me this time because I felt, yes, it's going to be Prevost. So it was Prevost. So I felt very kind of ready for it, I suppose.
Interesting. It was such an interesting moment.
The name did come as a surprise, and I immediately thought, wow, this is. I mean, I think we all did, and we were right. Okay, this is a very clear identification with a pope who was famous, of course, for Rerum Novarum Catholic social teaching, but also for a new, energetic, evangelizing kind of papacy. And I felt that there's a whole program in that name that I got really quite excited about. And then I suppose the other thing is that there's a book, by the way, that you've probably seen that's out now by Jerry O'Connell and Elisabetta Piquet on the Conclave, and it's subtitled Francis's Last Surprise. It's quite a bold title, but in many ways I think we do reflect, I think we all agree, there's a sense in which Francis prepared the way for Prevost's election. And in fact, not many people knew that back in February when Francis was in hospital, he had elevated Prevost to the rank of cardinal bishop. Now, this is very nerdy, Vaticanisty stuff, but there are very few cardinal bishops. There are 3 ranks within the college. It's a very, very signal honor. And I remember one cardinal saying to me, I think Francis was sending us a message that we need to widen the list of candidates, by doing that. But the more I'd heard about Francis, the more I heard about Prevost in the Vatican and the relationship he had with Francis led me to understand that this was going to be a papacy that was going to take forward the great reform of the Francis pontificate in a very different way, very different style, which I know we'll get into. But I like your analogy very much. The other analogy that came to me was one we used during the synod. If Francis enlarged the space of the tent, Leo was the one who was going to make fast the pegs.
Absolutely. That's a great
to
analogy.
consolidate and to build the bridges, particularly to those for whom the pontificate was difficult to
Well, and I remember that moment as well. I think what was striking to me was that so many people around the world were watching at that moment, right? Something going on in the Catholic Church, and it had captured the interest of really the globe. And in Rome, you feel it, right? People stream into St. Peter's Square from every possible entrance. It gets full all the way down Conciliazione. It just feels very much...
Recently that Harry Styles was there.
Harry Styles was there, who knew? But anyway, Chris, I want to take you back to that moment as well. And I know what I felt was, again, this sense you don't know. I think that's why people are so interested. One of the last true great surprises that we have in a world where everything seems to be known. What did you feel at that moment? What did you feel when you heard Leo XIV as the director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life? I was very excited. What did you think? And did you see him as a sort of a pope of change, of continuity? What do you think?
Yeah, I was on set with NBC and MSNBC, and there's just, as Austen mentioned, you have so much time between when white smoke appears and the new pope walks out, and so you have news, but you don't know what that news is, and so you're just kind of talking about possibilities and hypotheticals, and so you're left to just kind of sort of fill time. And at one break, I was having a sidebar conversation with Bishop Robert Barron, who was doing some interviews at the time, and he said, "Oh well, with this happening so quickly, it's clearly Cardinal Parolin, who was Pope Francis's longtime Secretary of State and seasoned diplomat." And he said, "Who do you think?" And I said, "Oh, I think it's Cardinal Prevost." And he said, "Oh." that's something only reporters would make up to try to sell newspapers. I share that story just simply to sort of convey, so many people had written off this possibility. And so even though, as Austen said, it wasn't the shock of 2013 where a complete unknown emerged, it was a real surprise. And in that moment, people are scrambling. What does this say about Francis? Is this, to what extent was it a referendum on what he did? Is this change? Is it a course correction? Or is it continuity? And my answer is it's both. In terms of its change and continuity. And I think Francis himself was a candidate of change because he believed the church should always be changing in the sense that it should be sensitive to the signs of the times. And of course, now Pope Leo, I think, is demonstrating that. But it's continuity in the sense of the same sort of style of operating. Pope Leo, in his first talk, when he walked out on the balcony, he gave a very short speech. It was about 500 words. And he kind of gave us a blueprint of what to expect in the early days. For starters, he used the word synod. He said he wants a church that is synodal. And for those of us who saw the conclave as, in a sense, a referendum on synodality, I think it was a clear signal that we are continuing on this path as church. Then he used the word peace 9 times, which I think was showing real attentiveness to just the state of the world. That he saw, to use Francis's language, a third world war being fought in piecemeal. And he wants the church to use its voice to sort of counter that and to be an agent of peace. And then he said he wants a church that is capable of building bridges and listening to everyone. And when I heard that, I couldn't help but think of hearing Francis use the phrase todos, todos, todos that very first time in Lisbon, talking a church open to all. And I think we got all of that from Leo in 500 words. And so I thought, this is a guy who is continuing on the same agenda. It is an era of change, but it's the same continuity.
I feel like that's a description of the Catholic Church in many ways, right? Continuity and change. I think one of my favorite phrases that Francis used to say, Austen, was, it's not about worshiping ashes, but about keeping the fire burning. I wonder if, before we sort of talk a little bit more broadly, if you could talk about synodality for a minute. Chris, we've talked about it several times here, and I just want to be sure we have it out on the table. What it means, why it was important to Francis, what sort of way it's taking root in the church now.
I think the origin of his vision for synodality comes in a homily that he gave many years before he was Pope in a place called Aparecida in Brazil, which was the shrine where the Latin American bishops held their first continental meeting in 15 years. And Bergoglio's homily said, very briefly, talked about how the church is led by a spirit. And he said, we do not want to be a Gnostic church, but a praying church. And then he ends with this vision of the people and the pastors listening to each other and listening to the Spirit and together building the church. Now, what did he mean by Gnostic? The danger is of a church where all we do is proclaim a knowledge, a doctrine. And the danger of that is self-sufficiency. We start to become, if you like, delighted by the clarity of our explanations for everything. And we shut out the Spirit. And so I think for Francis, the dynamism of the church is in this, this tradition that we hold, that we preserve, the truths that have been handed on to us, and then what Jesus promises to the church, which is that the Spirit will lead us into the whole truth. And he didn't promise that, by the way, for one particular moment. It's a constant throughout the church. The Spirit will continue to lead us into the truth. The truth is always therefore unfolding. So the vision of a synodal church is a church of communion and participation, which is missionary, but is constantly growing and building itself through this mutual listening, through which we hear the Spirit. I once asked Francis very directly when I was sat down, I said, synodality, how do you sort of summarize it? And he says, look, it's like this. We believe that the Spirit has been poured out on all the baptized faithful. So to find out what the Spirit is saying to the church, it makes sense that we get together to find out what the Spirit is saying to you and to you and to me, and together we discover what the Spirit is saying to the church. And he didn't then go on to say this, but a church in which authority is rooted in that deep listening is the synodal church. But it requires a learning, a way of being which is not familiar to us.
Well, and Chris, let's talk about it a little bit more with you. I think you covered this synod on synodality, I'll call it for ease of reference, over the course of those several years. I was there in October for the 2 Octobers and worked on it, throughout as well. And it was just this remarkable process and global. What I was struck by was really understanding and seeing the global nature of our church, people from all over the world, from all walks of life. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it was, what it meant to cover it, what you learned in that process, and where we're going forward.
I'm glad Austen did such a fine job of explaining synodality. It's an editor's worst nightmare to see synodality in a headline, because it's a head scratcher for people who aren't familiar with the inner workings of the church. But we were, again, all there together in October 21 when Pope Francis inaugurated and officially launched the Synod on Synodality. And I have to say, it was a strange time. The world was still emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic. For a lot of people who traveled to Rome in that moment, it was the first time they'd gotten on a plane in years. And the fact that it was sort of a moment for the church to go out, to not just sort of be in Rome, but to go out. There was this real energy that you could sense, and it was palpable there in Rome, that there is something special happening in the life of the church in this moment. And so over that sort of 3-4 year period, I got to see the Synod in action, either traveling with Pope Francis to various locations around the globe or in Rome. And the thing I can say is that it didn't matter if the Pope was in Mongolia, where he was going to visit a tiny, tiny Catholic community, or if he was in Congo, or if he was in Europe. There was this sense that this was a new moment in the life of the church, that the people of God had been invited to have a say in what was happening in their church, and they felt that in a real intense way. They felt listened to. And that made them want to participate. And I think I don't have any illusions. Synodality is still in its nascent stages. I think that has to be understood. But it's about a process, a new way of being church. Synods are no longer simply an event. It's not about one document. And this sort of sea change is what we're continuing to witness under Leo.
Interesting. I want to talk a little bit about that change of epoch. Francis also often used that phrase, a change of era, a change of epoch that we're in. What do you see, Austen, as we move from Francis to Pope Leo? I think we've talked a little bit about the shift from a Eurocentric church to a global church. I'm always struck by the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century, we were a church of several hundred million, mostly based in Europe. Now we're a church of 1.6 billion people spread around the world. Are we at a particular moment in that development?
We are. I mean, the hypothesis is really, I would put it like this. If you consider that the first millennium of Christianity was really the Church of the East, the first 8 councils were held on Eastern soil. The second millennium was the Church of Europe with its dynamic centre in Rome. We've now entered into the third millennium, and what one might argue is a third kind of church, which is a global multipolar church. Multipolar meaning that there are many dynamic centres, but led at the moment by Latin America, where most of the world's Catholics live, and which produced this discernment of the signs of the times in Aparecida, which is the basis for this new roadmap for the church. So this is the new era we're in. It was actually foreseen in the 1970s by theologians after the Second Vatican Council. They foresaw this, that would happen one day. I think it happened in 2013. That's when the shift took place. Francis, the first Latin American Pope, then opens the doors to this new global era. And why synodality is so crucial is because we have to manage now a church in which there are many different cultural expressions of Christianity, which, when you bring them into the room, sound like they're quite hard to reconcile. And it's only living in the tension of those disagreements and differences that we can find the way forward. So my contention would be that we are now in what Francis called the change of era. Not just an era of change, but the change of era. A historical shift has taken place. He was the one who threw open the doors to this. And I see Leo, he's a genetic maelstrom, even in his, he has so many different nationalities in him. There's 2 books, by the way, you can buy now, biographies of Leo. One is the biography of the first American Pope, and the other is a biography of the first Peruvian Pope. You can take your pick with Leo. And actually, isn't that the reality? And I say this now as a European looking at America. There's so much going on in this new continent where all this is mixed up. So I think I see Leo as taking that era forward, but perhaps able to build bridges in a way that Francis couldn't, because of his extraordinary experience as a global, as a leader of a religious order who spent 10 years crisscrossing the earth. So I think this is the excitement for me of this new era. It's no longer a European-centered church, and it's no longer concerned with neo-Christendom. In other words, actually most of the church now exists mostly in places where the alternative to Christianity is not secularism, but other faiths.
Interesting. Chris, why don't you talk? Let's move a little bit now to talk about Pope Leo, talk about what do you see as his priorities? We're about 1 year in now. Significant messages, decisions, priorities. Do you agree with Austen about the idea that he is a true global leader in a way that we perhaps have not had?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a man who, as priest, as Austen said, spent a lot of time on the road. The Augustinians are in over 50 countries, and he visited them all. And so he understands, he has this global missionary perspective. In his first year, I mean, I think on one hand, he's doing what he wants the entire church to do. He's been listening. He is trying to take stock of where the church is. And I think we see that just from his daily calendar. You know, he's got a full slate of appointments every day, and he's listening to everyone and anyone in the church, it seems, because I think he wants to have a well-rounded perspective. But I think his priorities have emerged very quickly. We heard them on that first night. And then, you know, his first teaching document was on the poor, putting the poor at the heart of the church. It was a document that I think both, in a sense, it's quite poetic because it was a document started by Francis, finished by Leo, and I think that speaks to their actual continuity, the fact that this was a priority shared with both of these men, and I think that's what he's calling us all to. In terms of other issues, certainly we've seen him prioritize the issue of migration. He's been nudging the U.S. bishops in this country to be united, to be out there, and to be vocal in opposing mass deportations. And I think he is someone who believes in the principle of subsidiarity, who really wants to use his power he'll use his voice when necessary, but I think he wants to see bishops lead first in their respective countries. Certainly, we've seen him prioritize, climate and ecological issues. And of course, by taking the name Leo as a pope, who at the height of the Industrial Revolution, stood with workers amidst tremendous technological change, he sees that happening in our own time with AI. And I think we can certainly expect his new encyclical, whenever that is, to tackle that head on.
Thanks for that. I want to pick up on something you said. Chris talked about Dilexi Te, this document on the poor, started by Pope Francis, finished by Pope Leo. Francis often talked about being a poor church for the poor. The poor and vulnerable were at the heart of his mission. He traveled to countries really in places that would be forgotten, unfortunately, by other media coverage or other world leaders. Can you talk a little bit more about what that meant for Francis and how you see that focus, and particularly in Dilexi Te under Leo?
I love Dilexi Te. I mean, it imports a huge slab of Latin American theology right there into the heart of the universal magisterium, with a kind of audacity and a straightforwardness which would have been inconceivable, 20 years ago. So the priority or the message of that theology in Dilexi Te is to say that actually Christ is firstly present to us in the suffering and in the pain of the margins and of the poor. And the poor church, but I understand a poor church for the poor when Francis said that. Obviously, we're talking here about the reality of material poverty, but we're also talking about a poverty of spirit, a humility that the church now. So here's how I would put it: in Aparecida, they saw that secularization was not something to be threatened by, but rather an opportunity for transformation and conversion, whereby the church learns to proffer its message, as Christ did, from a place of poverty and simplicity, rather than depending on hankering after status, power, and privilege, which in a sense is that combating secularization, beneath that agenda is an agenda to want to recover a certain kind of importance and status. So I think that's how I see Poor Church for the Poor, that a poor person can look at the church and see Christ who stayed on the margins in his ministry because people followed him because they recognized in him the God who gives them dignity, and that the church always needs to be identified on the world stage and in society with allowing the dignity of the poor to be recognized. And I see that so clearly in Leo. In his own life story, I mean, he goes to Peru in his early 30s, having had, I think, a pretty sort of suburban Chicago upbringing, and he's blown over by the poverty that he sees. He suffers terribly, but then at some point decides, this is where God wants me. And from then on, just learns to live with and to serve the poor, and dedicates the rest of his life to that. And he's brought that to the papacy, just as Francis brought that same. And I think we're so, it's such a wonderful thing now to have two papacies so clearly rooted in what Francis called the existential peripheries of this world. And what a powerful testimony that is, in a world where people are struggling all the time for domination and status and power.
I love that. I think that's very true. And I wonder, Chris, I'm struck that you went on so many travels with Pope Francis. And in so many cases, he went to parts of the world that, as I said, had been forgotten. And he did it to bring attention to that. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about any of those trips and what it meant to be in those places for people from those countries. In what way did he bring the peripheries to the center, if you will? And do you see that with Pope Leo going forward?
Yeah, Pope Francis was a real jet setter. He traveled to over, I'm going to get the numbers wrong. I think it's around 80 countries during his time as Pope. And I'll just share one story. In 2024, in September of 2024, Pope Francis, 87 years old, ailing, having difficulty walking, decided to go on the longest trip of his papacy. It was a trip that his doctors had advised him against. Many in the Vatican thought it was a trip that was foolish, and that, frankly, it wasn't going to happen. Everyone just kind of said, oh, it's on the books, but we'll see. And it was a 2-week journey through Southeast Asia and Oceania. And on the second country he visited, we were in Papua New Guinea. And on the second day of the trip, he didn't just go to the capital. He then, the next day, boarded another flight where we went, I think it was 2 or 3 hours, to the edge of a jungle, to this particular village that often goes half a year without ever seeing a priest. And the Pope went to them to say that you're not forgotten. And I think that embodied how he thought about papal travel, to think about where can I put the spotlight on a particular community, be they Christian, Muslim, Jewish, it doesn't matter. He wanted to elevate those that had been forgotten. And that's sort of how he used papal travel, particularly knowing that he had the world's press traveling with him. It was a way that he could say, you can't look away from this.
And now Pope Leo, I wonder if I could have your reaction to his trip to Turkey and Lebanon. And in particular, something that came out of that for me was the idea of first going to Lebanon, a country that has suffered so much and is suffering so much now. And you've heard his words now about Lebanon and about the people there and what they're suffering. And of course, in the wider Middle East and in Iran. What do you think about that trip for Leo, what that signaled, and what his future travels might signal?
Sure. Well, of course, he was in doing that trip, it was in the diary because of Francis. And Leo, of course, there's something very beautiful about Francis leaving us halfway through the Jubilee of Hope, on Easter morning as well, which is an extraordinary symbolism. But actually, Leo comes in and has the diary already full, and he spends the rest of the year carrying out, in a sense, that role, including that remarkable trip. And of course, the fact that it was Lebanon, it was the Middle East, now given the situation we're now in, to show that the Middle East was not forgotten was extremely important. Nicaea, key moment, of course, of Christian unity. I see this, the bridge building. Here's how I see Leo. The world order, you may have noticed, has collapsed. It collapsed in February when Francis was in hospital, and it's been collapsing ever since.
Say more about that.
Well, it's really, so to go back to what Chris was saying about why couldn't you have an American Pope, the assumption was that America was upholding the post-war global order. And you couldn't have, and that was the responsibility of America. That's why you couldn't have American Pope as well, too much power together. But actually, if America has renounced that role of upholding the world order, then we're in a very, very different world. What kind of an order replaces the world order? Well, at the moment, it's disorder. It's domination of the strongest. And the Cardinals were very aware of this in the Conclave. They spoke a lot about this. And I felt those words about peace from Leo and bridge building, I think that the papacy becomes the place that the world now looks to start to rebuild a new order, better than the one we had before. And I think that is the responsibility that falls on Leo's shoulders. No small task.
Well, I am struck that Leo has spoken up quite often and for the international rules-based order, obviously has been speaking up for peace. I wonder, Chris, if you could talk a little bit more about, you referenced the situation in America, if we talk a little bit more about Leo's relationship to the United States. He is a pope originally from Chicago. We have seen bishops, U.S. bishops, speaking out more, speaking up for migrants, speaking up for peace, speaking up for, again, the rules-based order. What do you think about that relationship between Pope Leo and American bishops? Are you seeing something different happening here? And what might it mean in future years?
Yeah, I think Leo has been deeply concerned about what he witnessed from a distance before he became Pope at, in many respects, the sort of tepid response among much of the U.S. hierarchy to Pope Francis. And I think he is very much invested in helping to unify the hierarchy in his home country. I remember the very first time I met him before he became Pope, he simply asked, basically, what's wrong with the U.S. Church? You know, why is there so much resistance to Pope Francis? And now that he's Pope, he is sitting with that, and I think he feels the burden of the office of and the need for a unified church in this moment. Austen hinted at, just the way we've seen, just the collapse of multilateralism, something the Holy See has been very much committed to, especially since the end of the Second World War. And I think he's trying to reorient the U.S. in that direction. Again, I think he's leaning on U.S. bishops to take the lead. We saw him back in the fall when he met with Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso, when he said, and Bishop Seitz had brought over a group of delegates from the border. And he said, this is an area where we need the U.S. bishops to do more, to raise their voice. And I think we've seen that recently in the statements, the joint statements from Cardinals McElroy, Tobin, and Cupich on the broader sort of collapse and the sort of immoral foreign policy, as they characterized it. So I think this is something that is a front burner issue for Leo. It's keeping him up at night. I think he wants to provide support, but I also think he wants them in the lead.
Let me just come back to you a little bit on that, and then we're going to go to audience questions. So please be ready for questions for either or both of our discussants here. So Austen, Francis was often criticized here in the United States as someone who just didn't get us. And now, of course, Pope Leo is from here, has this relationship Chris has just described. What do you see? What opportunity do you see for Leo? What do you think about how people dismissed Francis in that way?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it was always obvious to me that Francis understood America extremely well, but they didn't like what he had to say. And I think the reason for that, I mean, my experience of coming to the US over the years was that I've always found that the people of God loved Francis, and statistically that was borne out. And that the resistance to him came from certain, how can I put it, well-funded intellectual elites who had particular agendas. And I think prior to Francis had, at least in their own minds, reconciled Catholic teaching with a right-wing agenda, both on economics and the market, and in the area of sexual morality. And Francis, of course, presented them very early on with a rather different agenda, beginning with Laudato Si and so on, and then, of course, in Amoris Laetitia. So I think, rather than analysing it all, just to say, the Francis pontificate is a shock to a certain kind of establishment Catholicism, and they didn't forgive him. And having spent a very long time lecturing us about the need to be loyal to the papacy, this then became the very sector that turned its back on Rome and entered into a kind of schism. So that's the story of the last 13 years. I think with Leo's election, what I see is Francis is now speaking with a Chicago accent. And you can no longer use this patronizing idea that because he's, from Latin America and he doesn't understand free markets, therefore we can ignore him. So I think the Leo papacy offers another kind of a shock. But I think it's a real opportunity because, Leo's whole manner of being, Francis, was very direct. He was prophetic. And his whole style, I think, was destabilizing for a certain kind of person who looks to popes to be a certain way, if I can put it that way. Leo, of course, his gentleness and his graciousness and his bridge-building ethos, I think many people gives an opportunity for much of the American church to rebuild the links with Rome. But my own prediction is that as they discover that the roadmap is really very, very similar to the previous one, this attempt to realign with Rome, for some, will come under strain, but for others it will be the opportunity for a rethink, and that's a wonderful thing. And I do see now, by the way, the US bishops are now, speaking together, united in a way that they really haven't been. So I think it's a wonderful moment, actually, for the US church.
I think it's a wonderful moment. I want to pick up on something you said, which was this idea that the resistance to Francis was very much a sort of narrow elite group, but that consistently over the course of Francis' pontificate, he was very, very popular within the Pew Catholics in the United States. And I want to point to a moment, you mentioned Cardinal Cupich. I think anybody who follows Cardinal Cupich knows that he's not a sort of sentimental, touchy-feely type of person. And yet what I was struck by, in the weeks after Pope Leo's election, he was being interviewed by Lester Holt, I believe, of NBC News. And Lester Holt asked him what it meant to have an American as a pope, and he started to tear up, and he choked up as he responded. And he said it meant the culture, our culture, meaning Chicago, right? Cardinal Cupich is from Chicago. This Chicago culture, our culture, our American culture produced a pope. And what he meant by that were the fish fries, the CYO basketball, the Knights of Columbus, the ladies taking, food to the poor, the women religious in our we have such a tradition of women religious in our country who have served the poor everywhere across this country. That's the culture that he meant. And it's produced a pope now. And I think for Americans, it just means so much in our hearts. And it could be a moment of pride in some way, but I experience it much more as a moment of humility. Like, what is it for us to learn from the global church? How are we being called to contribute? Is that fair? Would you say that's something you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think with Leo, we can see this hesitancy early on not to lean too much in his Americanism. Even the night he appeared on the balcony, he spoke in Italian and then he spoke in Spanish. He did not speak in English. I think that was very much intentional. At the same time, as time has gone on, we'll see him take the pizza or the hot dog. We'll see him, smack talk some people when it comes to sports, that sort of thing. And I think that's his own sort of bridge building. He recognized there is some healing to be done. And as Austen said, it's a chance for people to come on board. It's an invitation. And now that's the invitation to everyone.
Great, thank you. So now it's time for questions from you all. Please raise your hand. We have microphones going on either side. And over here. Please identify yourself before you ask your question.
Hi, thank you. My name is John Walsh. I'm a Georgetown class of '86. My question is, I don't believe I heard any of you talk about Leo's age as a factor in the election, and if you could talk about what it might mean to him now that he is Pope.
Great question. Why don't you start, Austen?
Well, I mean, just to say, he is a 70-year-old. And not just a 70-year-old, but an extremely fit 70-year-old. I don't know whether you heard the story about his personal trainer in Rome. He'd been going to this personal trainer for 2 years since being in Rome, but this guy didn't really know who he was. He just knew him as Roberto, and then saw him come out on the balcony as Pope, and had obviously a considerable shock. And the journalist then sort of found him, and he very freely shared details of Leo's physique in quite a lot of detail, which made you realize he is in a very, very good condition for a 70-year-old. He rides horses, he swims in Castel Gandolfo now every week. And why is that important? Well, because his physicality, his physical fitness means that we can expect this to be a papacy of vigor and longevity, and that matters in this world and this time of turbulence. So thanks you for the question, and I think that was, for the Cardinals, of course, the age is always a question. I think they agreed that around 70 was the sweet spot, somewhere between 65 and early 70s is the sweet spot.
Yeah, it's a tough thing because it's a job for life, so you don't want to give it to someone too young because, the papacy of John Paul II looms large in the background, 30 years, and there's just, I think, general concerns about the demands of the job and giving it to someone that they might be doing it for 30 years. But where I do think it makes a huge difference is, Francis, didn't plan to be elected Pope. But once he became Pope, I think he always felt in a sense as if he was running out of time. He gave that interview early on where he said, 4 or 5 years and then I'm off to the Father's house. Leo could be Pope for a very long time. And I think that allows him, gives him obviously the necessary sort of runway to do the job. But I think he dispositionally is an institutionalist. And so I think this will play to his strength to sort of say, okay, what's the game plan? And we've got time here to catch our breaths before we act. And I think that's why some people would argue that he's had kind of a boring first year in office because they want to see him doing more. We were used to Francis being the Pope of surprises, and Leo is a much more measured personality, but he knows he's got the space to do that. And I think that's freeing.
In many ways, I think that's right. Other questions? Ray.
Rick, when did they first meet? When did they first meet? And when did they first notice each other? I think those are two different questions.
Yeah. Do you want to go?
Well, so as soon as the Pope died, the Cardinals were called to Rome.
No, we did Leo and Francis, Robert Prevost.
I'm so sorry. Well, go on. Yeah.
I don't know the year, but it was at the time when Francis was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and he was the head of the Augustinian order. And I believe their very first meeting was one of effectively conflict, or soon thereafter it was conflict. Not any sort of serious conflict ideologically. It was over a priest personnel assignment. And a member of the Augustinians that was in Buenos Aires, and the details are fuzzy about where he should go, and Bergoglio wanting him to go somewhere, and Prevost wanting him to go somewhere else. That was where they first met. It was really in 2016, 2017 when they began to spend quite a bit of time together. That's when Prevost was named as a member of the clergy and then bishops. Started coming to Rome quite often. They would have lunch privately, and I think they got along after that.
Why? Why did that happen?
What happened?
Why did they start to connect?
Well, it's a great question. I think that I can imagine that they had a lot in common. They're both religious. They both had very senior roles in their religious orders. Both very interested in formation. And both, of course,
say what you mean by that for people who don't.
Formation, as in formation. I mean, in a religious order, the formation of the members of that religious order are always very important. The development of them, and both of these men had been at different times of their life very much dedicated to the formation. So I think they would have had a lot to talk about. And it's very interesting. This encounter, which I believe was 2001 or so, when they had the disagreement. Of course, Bergoglio would have respected Prevost a lot for defending the autonomy of his order, just as he, as a Jesuit, would have done to another bishop. So I don't think, Prevost used to joke about this and say, well, I knew, therefore I wouldn't be made a bishop. But I think the opposite was the case. Then, of course, Francis says to him, when he's coming to the end of his time as Prior General, Francis has just been elected Pope, and Francis is invited by Prevost to celebrate the Mass of the meeting of the Augustinians in, I think, September or October of that year. And Francis apparently says to Prevost something like, you can relax for now, but I'll be coming back for you. And the following year names him Bishop of Chiclayo in Peru. And in Chiclayo, as I understand from his successor, who I know well, who's a friend, he really implements the Francis vision in an extraordinary way. Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, formation of lay people, synodality, women holding significant posts in the diocese. It's a very strong transformation of that diocese, very much according to the Francis model. So I think Francis sees him in Chiclayo, and then brings him to Rome, essentially to put him in charge of appointing bishops, entrusting to him at that moment the future of the Catholic Church. If you appoint the bishops, you reshape the future. And then the other thing I think we all learnt is that they spent in Rome every Saturday together in these very long, intense conversations. Various cardinals have told me that Prevost was the cardinal that Francis most closely worked with in those 2 years, 2023 to 26.
As head of the office, that was appointing bishops. And in that role, he also traveled quite a bit with Francis, too. So they really did have a closeness that I think goes underreported simply because we see them as so different. Other questions? John, and then as Julia.
John Borelli here at Georgetown. Back to your comment on Francis, Austen. I agree with you. I think majority of Catholics in the U.S. appreciated Francis. But I think Francis also had an attitude towards North America, especially the United States, because of the interventionist policy of the United States and Latin America. I kind of picked that up, that he had less toleration. It seems, and of course, he was responsible for a paraceta, which was the best example of synodality to date. I mean, he was writing that. So I think at times he had little patience with us. You know, you're too big. You think of yourself too much. You know, let others speak. He had that kind of Latin American attitude towards the North, as they would say.
What do you think?
I know Latin America quite well, and I would say that attitude, resentment at interventionism, would be much more typical of Central America, Caribbean. I think Argentina has a very, well, we have some Argentinians here who can help us here, but I think it's a more complicated relationship with the US that they have. Look, I never sensed in Francis any kind of prejudice actually against anybody, even less Americans. And though I know that he deeply appreciated and deeply admired the American church. I mean, he once spoke to me about various lay people, you know, that he'd been in touch with and how much he admired them in the States. So you could be right, but I never picked up on it.
Back here, Julia.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm a freshman in Professor Daniels' class in CST. And in her course, we've been talking about how one of the greatest criticisms of Pope Francis was that while he was trying to push forward synodality, he tended to make decisions on his own. And you said in one of your articles, Mr. White, that Pope Leo seems to be pushing for a synodal church as a whole. Do you think his American identity might help in this in any sort of way?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is one of the things that I think he believes very deeply in is that the church and the Roman Curia, meaning the Vatican central bureaucracy, has to practice synodality in its own backyard if it wants the church to model synodality. And it's a very, Rome is a very siloed place, and Vatican offices don't talk to each other. And I think this is one of the things that I think in the early building blocks of his papacy, I think Leo is saying, all right, if we want the whole church to become more synodal, we have to model that here at home. And he's, nudging them, elbowing them to start doing that. And that's, the Roman Curia has been around for a very long time, very reluctant to change, but I think he sees that as essential.
And I was just in a conversation the last week with someone who was talking about the way that these silos are starting to break down, that people are starting to meet between curial departments, et cetera. So it's going to be interesting to watch that develop. David Hollenbeck.
David Hollenbeck.
Thanks a lot, David Hollenbach. I'm here at Georgetown. I appreciate both of your comments very much. And one thing that occurs to me that I just wanted to raise for you, the style between these two men seems to be quite different. And I remember John O'Malley's book on the Second Vatican Council makes the argument that the major breakthrough of the Second Vatican Council was in the style that it held out for the church. And I think that Francis had that style of a kind of informality, but also a participatory approach, living outside of the Vatican Apostolic Palace, living over at Casa Santa Marta, paying his own bills right after being elected Pope, a number of other things. Whereas Pope Leo seems to be moving in a more traditional style, moving back to the Apostolic Palace, wearing the red mozzetta, the cape that he wears, and so forth. I'm just wondering what you think about this style question and what we can expect about the two men seem to be quite different in that regard. And I'm wondering what you think about the significance of that.
I mean, when you first started talking about style, as John O'Malley talks about
That's what I
it,
thought,
it's about, as it were, how we treat each other. So, I mean, Francis would talk about God's style. The church needs to embody God's style. How God is with us is how we need to be with others, you know, gracious, respectful, hospitable, and so on. But then you move to talking about style in the sense of sort of where you live and how you dress. And I would say that Francis's massive contribution in this respect was to say that every pope needs to have the freedom to discern how best to do those things. I didn't see the mozzetta that Leo put on as a repudiation of Francis. I saw there Leo saying, I want the freedom to reconnect with the tradition, which Francis has perhaps sat lightly to for his reasons. And the Casa Santa Marta, you know, was an important moment because Francis said, I want to live in community. I don't want to be surrounded by courtiers. Leo has said, I want to go back to the Apostolic Palace, but not as popes used to live there. He's moving in there with a small community. He's installed a gym. I mean, it's taken a whole year to refurbish the place.
It is Rome.
In his own way.
And one thing I want to say about that, because there's so much hype, he just moved into the Apostolic Palace last Saturday. In the general congregations, those meetings between the death of the Pope and the election of a new one, all these issues are being discussed. And many cardinals told me that they talked about the Apostolic Palace not out of some sort of presentation to the world, but because of the fact that the Vatican's financial situation is in, you know, effectively in dire financial straits. And it was just a cost-saving measure. By moving into the Apostolic Palace, they no longer have to provide security for the Pope at Santa Marta and the Apostolic Palace.
And they can rent out the rooms.
Exactly, and it's a very practical concern.
And also, I think when we talk about style and talk about John O'Malley, I think of him talking about sort of a pre-Vatican II church. That's what I think of, the kind of opposition between hierarchical versus the people of God, or dialogical, et cetera. And in that sense, certainly, Leo is continuing the style of Francis, if we're thinking about it more in that larger way. One more question. I think we have time for one more. Maeve.
Oh, Tom, we're going to have Tom.
Maybe two more, Tom.
Hi, I'm Maeve. I'm a senior at Georgetown, and my question is about the youth in the church. We're seeing a really interesting move right now, specifically in America, where Gen Z is becoming more and more Catholic. But a lot of this is also being kind of tied with kind of far-right radicalism in a way. There also is a rise among the youth. So I'm curious how you see how Pope Leo, because we saw Pope Francis being really engaged with the youth of the church, and how you see Pope Leo kind of engaging with the younger people.
Chris, I'm going to give that to you first.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly, and I want Austen to weigh in because I know we were talking about this yesterday. I think Pope Francis, one of my favorite moments with Pope Francis covering him was that moment in Madrid at World Youth Day. You've got young people from all over the world, and he just, you know, he's struggling physically, and he says, you know, puts a script down, which is a nightmare for journalists because you're all panicking. What's he going to say? What's he going to do? And he speaks from the heart. He says, I want to speak to you from the heart because young people deserve credible witnesses. And that's when he used his famous todos, todos, todos line. And I think, you know, that message of a church that is credible and its witness is authentic. I think that is his approach writ large, but especially with young people. And I think Leo will follow a very, very similar script. In terms of the actual numbers and the rise of traditionalism, I'm giving that to Austen because that's far above my pay grade.
Well, we're talking in Europe about something called the Quiet Revival, which is quite striking. The numbers of people becoming Catholics at Easter has been rising really quite strongly over the last few years. This year has beaten all the records. There is something happening unquestionably. The way I would put it, I think, is something that Francis well understood, and in a Parasida they understood, which is that we are living through the collapse of a kind of neo-Christendom model where faith is inherited through identity and institutions. And rather, this is now a new apostolic age where the people coming to faith are coming through personal contact, through the experience of an encounter with the mercy of God. What's so interesting is that so many of them are beginning, and this is in your
The
field
digital
now,
environment, yeah.
they're first meeting a person of faith online. In other words, they have no contact with the institutional church. Now, the challenge for the Catholic Church nowadays is how do we reshape the church, answer Evangelii Gaudium, in such a way that we are able to accompany the seekers and the searchers who are finding their way to the church, while at the same time managing the expectations of a fast shrinking and declining, but nonetheless still significant presence of what one might call the cultural massgoers.
Well, and it's so interesting, right? We have really just generational thinkers, Father Thomas Halleck and others, thinking about what this transition means. And at the same time, we're at this interesting moment where people, as you said, they don't first meet the church by walking into a church. They first meet the church through some sort of digital engagement, so often, especially young people. But the question for the church and the challenge is, how do we take that experience and move it to an embodied encounter in a physical community with the sacraments, et cetera? And that is a wonderful opportunity that we're starting to see the fruits from. One last question.
Can I just quickly add, if you're interested in that, there is a synod report, group three, chaired by one Kim Daniels, which lays this out beautifully.
Go ahead, Father Tom Rees.
Thank you. Everybody seems to like Pope Leo. He's a great listener. I think one of the reasons he got elected was he didn't have any enemies. But in any case, he's a great listener. I would never want to play poker with him because he doesn't always reveal what he's thinking. But he's going to have to start making decisions. And I guess my question to both of you is, or three of you, what are the decisions that he's going to face in the future that are going to be the tough decisions that, you know, some people aren't going to like? Obviously, women deacons is one, but I'm sure there are lots of other issues that he's going to have to deal with, and some people are not going to like those decisions.
Austen, you want to start? Chris, start?
One, I think he's already shown his hand a bit when he rejected the U.S. bishop's idea of single-issue voting and abortion being the preeminent priority. I think when he said in October that very clear statement about what it means to be whole life and a strong endorsement of a consistent ethic of life, it was a strong signal to the church in this country of what he expected in terms of our pro-life witness. I think in terms of personnel, he's got big decisions to make inside the House. Big one would be, do I keep my Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, and if so, for how long? Popes typically bring in their own Secretary of State to handle foreign affairs issues. I suspect that will happen. And then other dicastery heads, particularly the dicastery for communications, and a few other offices that will be up for, replacements. So we'll get some indication through his personnel decisions. And then particularly as we build up to the Synod in 2028, what that looks like and what he is doing to get people on board with that, that will also be an indicator. But I think some of the particular issues will be punted for a while. And I think he has a long runway.
Thanks. Austen.
Yeah, so just to add to that brilliant list, one thing, which is what I see in Leo is the emergence, it came out of the pre-conclave as well, the need for synodality to be complemented by collegiality, which means how the bishops can better work together in the governance of the church. I think it's in the playing out of these two things that I think we're going to see a real development. And of course, it will involve tensions and decisions that will need to be taken. So all those issues that you've mentioned, if you like, put into that pot now of synodality and collegiality, I think that's what I'm looking out for.
And the question and the challenge is whether those tensions can be fruitful instead of being conflictual and unproductive, whether they can be fruitful. If I would add one more, I would say, we've mentioned that he has that Pope Leo has talked about, and we've heard about an encyclical that will be coming out, and we've been told that it'll be focused on Catholic social teaching, that it'll have a part of it that discusses artificial intelligence and developments there. You mentioned Evangelii Gaudium earlier, which was Pope Francis' blueprint for his papacy, right? The sort of initial encyclical that he owned and really set a path forward. And I'm interested to see what that document will say, because I think that it will have particulars in it that will signal a path forward that will make some upset, make some happy, and in many ways, though, produce that kind of fruitful tension that'll give us a path forward. Thank you both for being here. This was wonderful. Please join me for a second in thanking our panelists. And I want to tell you right now about a remarkable, we have another conversation on deck tomorrow night that I really hope we see you at. It's tomorrow evening's Dahlgren Dialogue here at Georgetown, co-sponsored with our colleagues in Georgetown's Office of Mission and Ministry. And it's on faith, democracy, and the common good, lessons from John Courtney Murray for our times. We have a leading scholar of John Courtney Murray, David Hollenbeck, here with us today. I know he'll be with us tomorrow night as well. It's going to feature Vincent Rougeau, who's the president of the College of the Holy Cross, Rob Vischer, who is the president of the University of St. Thomas, Kathy Caveney from Boston College, a leading scholar on Catholic social teaching and theologian and legal theorist, and our own Cardinal Robert McElroy, Archbishop of Washington. You can see follow-up resources from this conversation on our website. The video will be posted in a day or two. And I want to particularly thank my colleagues, Kim, Anna, Christian, Blaine, Luke, and Neil for their help in organizing this event, and to all of you for joining us here, both in person and online. So once again, please join me in thanking Chris and Austen.